afternoon, everybody. I remember doing an assignment for Dr. Anurag Mishra, which I was thinking about when I was sitting there. He'd made us write about the ethic of psychoanalysis. I was just thinking what would be the ethic of my paper. And I came across a forgotten piece written by Dr. Ambedkar in something which is called The Wounded History, in which he's called the people who stayed back after partition in India, both Hindus and Muslims, as belonging to a wounded town. He writes, and I quote, "In a wounded town, people find it difficult to relate to one another, since they are beset with the articulation of pain and trauma. It is here that they recover each other." I think the ethic of my paper is going to be people interacting in the confines of religion around this in this wounded town. Psychoanalysis, in the process of evolving the ego, fosters the image of reality which is ridden with internal conflict and yet remains ahistorical and atemporal. Recovering this historicity and locating it in temporality, images of the collective in the individual story in this paper address religion as an analytical symptom. Clinical work has been shared to illustrate how the Hindu-Muslim history of conflict foretold the unfolding of a psychotic personality structure in where the Hindu patient and the Muslim therapist respond from history that they have come to live as memory experience. The effort is to evolve a narrative of clinical work in India where the language of psychoanalysis acknowledges that the alphabets of religion embedded in the unconscious speak through the fragments of history and culture internalized by the psyche. This is a story from history with a past that has lost the memory of its own history, yet it retains its echoes through religion. I'll be talking about the case of Rupal, who remained caught in the split between Hindus and the Muslims. A 22-year-old female, Rupal came with symptoms of obsessive thoughts and compulsive rituals of undoing. These obsessive thoughts, which she called were negative thoughts, were experienced as curses directed at people she liked, including herself. Sessions contained obsessional details about morbid negative thoughts. They were gradually emerging as unconscious fantasies that she had of damaging the ones she loved. Unable to express anger towards them, she recovered a split image of self where she resided through the paranoid schizoid split, the good and the bad Rupal. All her aggressive fantasies were attributed to this bad Rupal who caused the very negative thought. Often during waiting for her, as I struggled with bouts of anger, the image of a shroud would come, persist throughout the session, but helped me to understand something about her anger, my anger, and a bodiless black shroud only to later carry the shielded but not yet dead anger. Her Pak Mohabbat with an older Muslim man was revealed carefully to me, since I was supposed to be angry for her for being in love with my man. As she spoke of the love for the older Muslim man, the image of the black shroud came again. It was a parda now. So what split part of her was hiding in this parda, which earlier was struggling with fantasies of dying and being killed, and now had found a new language of hiding? As sessions progressed, her relationship fantasies with the Muslim man began to reveal Muslim as an adjective which she had constructed with sexuality as an important feature. The man wanted to have sex with her, which outraged her, since this was in clear conflict with her idea of Pak Mohabbat, which is pure love, while he was just being Muslim. As she found herself moving away from the Muslim man who symbolized sexuality, which was terrible, she found herself caught in a gaze. She retorted, saying how everyone was jealous of her, particularly young women, since they weren't as beautiful as she was. What evolved then was an intensely paranoid narrative ridden with inflictions of jealousy by other women. However, it was through this intensely jealous allegation that she was finally able to recover herself as a somewhat beautiful woman. When she began talking about difficulties around other women and jealousies around them, the very complicated dynamic of her relationship with the mother emerged. She was coming to me twice a week for now about 2 years. On one moment where I was able to contain a visceral account of counter-transference, she recounted beatings of a child that was so vicious that the neighbors had to intervene and request her mother to stop. As a growing up girl, she vividly remembered that how her mother would scrutinize her body, asking her to strip, disapproving her various body parts. She would share details of her sexual married life with her husband and spoke in detail about how unfulfilled she was. She would reconstruct sexuality as an unquenching thirst of the body that would consume her. As she was there, describing horrors of her childhood, I felt tears brimming in my eyes as she sat there unable to cry. An interpretation of anger which came after a reverie of a baby being breastfed to a smother, she was handheld into incessant crying, which went on for approximately 2 weeks, only to reveal that how she felt scared, very scared by the mother. Her anger towards the mother was filled with such guilt that she ended up introjecting that anger within. Her fusion with the mother expressed any anger towards the mother as anger towards herself. She shared on how the mother had warned her to be away from Muslims since they were dirty and sexual. While listening to the traumatic childhood experience, the image of a penis came to me. Was sexuality felt intrusive by her, or was she looking for a penis to get back at the mother, who, as when she spoke of fantasies, as it encouraged Rupal to live them out? Was penis somewhere connoting her fear of sexuality? I awaited a more eager syntonic arrival of the image. Rupal recovered stories that her mom had told her about rape and killing of Hindus during partition. She was against any idea of sexual relation and said how any nearness with a Muslim would devoid her of even health. Describing the warnings her mother gave her against sexuality, she found her sexuality awakened, but at the same time, her sexual fantasies tormented her in intense negative thoughts. The reverie came back about the penis, where it perhaps implied restoring sexuality in a session which was occupied with losing cursed body parts. I began to wonder, was this very Muslim penis cursed? My image as a Muslim therapist came alive when she took a break from sessions during the month of Ramzan. She wished to make me a good Muslim by assuming I would fast, and hence didn't want me for making me work. In answer to an interjection of her fantasy, she retorted in anger, saying fasting was the smallest thing I could do to be a Muslim, since otherwise for the Hindu boyfriend with whom I was living in and wearing bindis, I was hardly a Muslim. This was the first time her fantasy was resolute and edged on disgust for me. As her voice found anger with respect to me, her anger found voice for the mother. She was a bitch and should be dead. Her anger engulfed both me and the mother. We were the same. I was pushing her towards sexuality by not being with a Muslim man. Just the way she felt, she was unconsciously seduced by the mother to live out sexuality as if on her behalf. For 6 months in the session, then a complex dynamic of social and psyche was played out. Any national, international encounter between terrorists who were invariably Muslim brought fear in her of being seen as a Hindu who hated the Muslim and hence got hate in return. It was the projection of her hate on me which was both historical, of me being a Muslim, as well as personal. I was a sexually aggressive mother who she was fused with and could not separate from. She would beg me on on those days and plead how I should forgive her and not hate her since she was ill. As I became the object of her projections, where I robbed her of her sexuality, her relations with her mom began to emerge from the paralysis of intense anger and frozen fears of a mother's nannies. The Muslim therapist who had been trusted turned out to be a traitor for her safety, while the lost communion with the kinship, the Hindu mother, was restored. While her restorative bonds were recovering, a fatality broke all delicate threads between reality and fantasy. She lost her mother within a month to the last stage of cancer. Shocked and stunned, where she couldn't cry, she recovered a stammering scream. "You killed my mother." Her fantasy was of my wanting her as my daughter, cursing the mother for the same. She was able to imagine losing the mother only when somebody else wanted her as a daughter, so she did not have to lose a mother. In the session, I felt my body going into a rocking posture, such that I became aware of it and folded my hands. It was our last session. Rupal's case exemplifies two noteworthy features which led us to understand the praxis of religion in her psychic life: projections and its identifications. Rupal's stirring of sexuality stayed out of her ego, as did her anger for her mother. She projected them into my part image of being a Muslim, which she recovered as a whole. For her while carrying her projections, I could only be seen as a Muslim, nothing else. Her constructions of Muslims having increased sexual appetite, a predisposition to violence, and implications in terrorist activities were entirely her own. Indian history and culture are replete with these images of Muslims post-partition. Kakkar writes in Colors of Violence how the constructions of Muslims by Hindus were that of rampant sexuality and fervor of aggression. He also writes at how Muslims as well as Hindus become containers of disavowed parts of self. Akhtar, in his writings on Freud along the Ganges, further writes that how with the departure of the British, Hindus and Muslims created enemies out of each other, since there was a need felt of a single common enemy who could carry and contain hated parts. My being a Muslim therapist predisposed to me being historically having inherent features on which Rupal could project her unacceptable parts. Even though the Muslim became the one to whom sexuality and aggression belonged in the session, Rupal remained in its pursuit. Hence the Muslim therapist wasn't to be discarded, rather was to be kept near, since she held important parts for her. Rupal was able to recover her sexual fantasies as the silence in the sessions held her assault, creating a capacity for her to tolerate her own intense, aggressive, hated impulses. However, the outside world constantly echoed the disruption of Hindu-Muslim relations. The projections weren't fully identified with, and the negative thoughts kept plaguing her about me as a Muslim. Transference. The initial period of therapy saw transference moving from the benevolent, progressive, educated woman that I was to the persecutory, sexual, aggressive Muslim that I became. My imagined intense attack on her made me the Muslim that I was and relegated her to being an assaulted Hindu. While transference continued to be a significant internal dialogue for Rupal, it also spoke through existing cultural images. The expression of the other through self did not only connote the transference dominated by inner demons, but also images made available through history, which already presented a narrative of Muslims' massacre of Hindus. Though it was a partial narrative which was retrieved and maintained for the unconscious purposes, it was of significance to understand how this very history sanctioned her feeling of persecution through the other, Muslim me. Now I wonder if Muslims and Hindus in India post-partition share a very psychotic relationship. Both communities, narcissistically omnipotent, only imagine the other as an extended part of themselves, which also serves as a container of their discarded parts, producing a sense of reality which, however, can't be shared. Kakkar calls them the necessary other for each other. However, this necessary other, while remembered in culture, remains forgotten in this very clinical work. As a necessary illusion of Winnicott, it helps retain an omnipotent version of self, under whose shadow a psychotic relationship of self and the other persists. This fragment of history can be borrowed to express how it was reminiscent of Rupal's relation with her mother. Rupal imagined destroying her omnipotence, while her mother, as if rejoiced creating her in her curses. Here history and psyche came closer in idioms of religion. Rupal's life, reconstructed in this clinical presentation, elaborates upon the central theme, religion as an analytical symptom. So when does a symptom become analytical? An analytical symptom can develop as a story which one has lived, inhabited and created for oneself, yet has lost the memory of. This story suspends itself from time and space. However, to define the analytical in the symptom, it has to include the opposite. The symptom as a story one has not lived, inhabited or created for oneself, yet manages to retain a memory of. This story remains suspended in time and space too. To say analytical symptom is to say how two opposites exist through each other, even when they are absent. While Rupal's life remained defined in symptoms by her obsession, compulsions and paranoid feelings, religion filled in the role of memory which as if her story had lost. Religion became the memory which placed her life in historical time and psychic space and created a historiographical anamnesis. It evoked images of Hindus and Muslims who, when recovered from historical legacy, brought her internal story into perspective. The anger which she wasn't able to fathom, or the sexuality which she remained unable to own, was projected onto the Muslim. It was this memory of the Muslim which when validated as arising from cultural present, evoked belonging to a cultural memory where violence and aggression was his forte. Consequence, the image of the Muslim as her culprit retained. Rupal's life is replete with this analytical use of religion which comes to be symptomatic. In her projections of aggression and sexuality onto her Muslim therapist, along with identifying them as her own parts, when the therapist manages to tolerate the intensity of the projections, she uses memory of religion suspended in time and space. Her transference of fusion and identification with the Muslim therapist uses memory of a story she has not yet lived. Rupal both fears the Muslim and desires to be like the Muslim, making it or her as an agent of religion. This Muslim agent of religion, while listening to the story of Rupal's life, is able to recover many images as nodal points of reveries which surfaced owing to what Rupal and I came to live out. It belonged to neither of us, rather belonged to the session. However, it comes to the historical and cultural self, which were containers of the memory where I was to use my location as a historiographical accountant. Nodal reveries. As Rupal's negative thoughts brought forth the split, causing good Rupal and bad Rupal, the image of the shroud hovered. The shroud was to reveal the parda, The Muslim who had begun appearing, even though in drapes, as soon as the internal psyche attributed a form to the band. Appearance of the shroud also carried images of admiration of the one in the shroud, the Muslim itself. Consequently, by admiring the Muslim, the parts of psyche were also trying to recover admiration of bad aspects as well. This admiration was important since without identifying, the psyche of the patient became empty. There was never a dead body in the shroud. It was always empty. Hence, identifying became important for the survival of self. Another reverie image came of that of the fondled penis looked at as if for the first time. It first appeared when the disturbance around the childhood and the preoccupation with sexuality by the mother was shared. Penis was used to draw contrast between images of the mother, penis being the only way one could organically differentiate as if between Hindus and the Muslims. With the penis, I became the Muslim who could contain as well as resist the sexuality of the mother. However, it also brought the question of gender alive. With the penis, how was I still the Muslim woman, or did I become the phallic mother who was to be feared more? It appeared again while sessions were filled with her sexual awakenings as well as cursing of lost body parts. It made a man out of me, in whose sexual background Drupal could hold her sexual strivings. With her sexual awakening in her, she became closer to the Muslim man whose penis she could now take in, even at the cost of losing or substituting a body part. Since I and Drupal shared a historical relation of religion, these images came to me which were telling of our relations. These relations embedded in culture became the lens through which the inner story of an interpsychic life was translated. When a relation between two opposites persists in absence, it is reconstructed through time and space. When these two opposites are Hindus and Muslims, as in the case of Drupal, then the relation which might appear absent or fragmented in the inner world of the patient comes to exist through a reconstruction from history and culture, evoking the very medium of this reconstruction, religion. When clinical realities converge with collective histories, transitional spaces develop. These spaces are containers of symbols which are born between the historical function and the reality creation. In Drupal's case, this transitional space is inhabited by religion. It is a symbol, in this case, where the cultural memory holds the image of the Muslim therapist, while the Hindu patient uses the current ongoing political external activity to create reality. The Muslim therapist and the Hindu patient might not belong to the overlapping worlds of conflict, rather are born to the cultural memory of permeated partition. Not being active agents of violence or riots, they still rile under the lurking silence of another assault. In this presented case, the impending assault around religion features internal chaos and projection of an individual story. The effort of this paper was to recover images of Hindus, Muslims, which originated as opposing in partition, having persisted across generation cultures in Indian society, and through this case have found their working through individual psyche in the clinical symptom manifestation. Ending note. Whether Drupal healed is a question I often ask. She hasn't come for clinical works in the last 1 year. Some effort that was made was cast away by the fervour of Modi becoming the next Prime Minister of India. This evoked intense fear in her of being cursed by so many Muslims if the speculations were to come true. she isn't able to overcome the enormity of the political essays of history regarding Hindus and Muslims. She calls me up in fear, sobs, tells me how she is suffering in the absence of her mother as well as mine. She told me about a month ago of how she wanted to resume therapy and was praying in the favor of Modi's losing so that I could survive for her. I wonder who she prays to.
Thank you. Questions?
I'll try to comment. I think your paper had quite an impact. I'm not part of the Hindu-Muslim history, at least as far as I know. And well, you never know. You never know. So, but the kind of impact it gives you is the kind of when something so enormous invades the private discussions, the private lives, which are beyond your own history even, and the patient's history, and which is somewhere lurking behind, and is so enormous, so that when you were speaking about it, it came into this room. So it's present alive here also. And it's something which is very difficult to talk about, because you can't resolve it easily. So what I want to say, I don't have a question, but I appreciate your sharing about this, because it is a very difficult and very alive issue.
Thank you so much. I think that helps. Questions always slip my mind because I'm very nervous. Comments stay, so thank you.
I just wanted to give the backbenchers a chance.
I was wondering if there was any idea that she brought to the sessions which you had most trouble resisting.
But yeah, I think the very idea of a Muslim therapist is completely unavailable to me. Also because you don't have a Muslim analyst in the country to fall back upon, excepting I think 2 in Bombay who don't write.
When did this come up in the session? Was it identified at the very beginning?
This came up in the sessions around the Butler House riots, when the Butler House encounter happened in Delhi and people were picked up from Azamgarh, and then and it was around Jamia, and I stayed there, and she was aware of that. And then she began her entire reconstructions around the Muslim mind pact and how I would deal with something like that. So then I think it was there that I was actually able to also catch what she was trying to say, and I think understand it more historically.
I think we should end it, Anila.
Yes.
We are running out of time.
We ran out of time 15 minutes ago.
One last one.
It's a small question. I'm actually a little confused, that's why I'm asking you. You think that coming from the same religion or same caste or same region makes the psychoanalytic process or the therapeutic process more difficult for the therapist?
Not really. I think if that was the case, then so much that we have in accounts of available access psychoanalytical literature would not be easily translatable. I'm saying that in this position, it is not just different religions, it's conflicted religions, it is opposing religions. That is where all fantasy is also becoming contained. if you come from the same religion, I guess sometimes a lot gets shared, which might have its own set of problems. Because then you can look at
That's what I was thinking.
what it
That
means
what
to
about
be.
the shared problems?
Shared problems, I think, were also a lot around education, around studying, around she was a literature student. There's so much of Nietzsche and Freud and Lacan came up, which I had to omit. And that became a lot of shared thing. But I think for the purpose of this paper, I wanted to present the conflicting when that becomes historically available and is brought into the session. What happens?
One last one.
Thank you. I enjoyed listening to you. I was wondering how would this new knowledge that you are Muslim and that your patient viewed in certain frame, how would this shape your thinking and writing from now onwards? Or I know that there is this element of the patient's fantasy that you elaborated on, and you said that I learned more about her than also about myself, but more about her. How would this, I'm very curious, and I'm sure there are many others who have similar questions.
I think it's interesting because Anup says sharing it, and he's always made us think about this idea that what is the question? So you can have this great, grand, beautiful paper, but if it doesn't lead you anywhere, what's the point? So that is what I was thinking when I finished it. So how does it make me a better therapist, voice therapist, business therapist? And I was thinking that it makes me listen to myself and to another person historically differently. So what she's then talking about in the session is this creation of what Ogden would call the analytical third, but it's not just between me and the patient and the me fantasy, but it is also how quietly, subtly, the culture is slightly brought in the clinic. So you also understand parts of cultures. You also understand people as containers of cultures and not just people. So I think the research question becomes slightly more different.
Thank you. Thank you, Zehra. Another please
And-
end, I think.
So this is related to this, also,